Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. In an episode last year, I spoke with Tava Olsen from the University of Auckland Business School about the government's plan to develop New Zealand's first national supply chain strategy. At that stage, the Ministry of Transport was in the early stages of the process, having issued a freight and supply chain issues paper. Now, the Ministry has issued the actual Aotearoa New Zealand Freight and Supply Chain Strategy. So it seems like a good time to take another look at this really large issue for our economy. To discuss this, what it means, I'm joined by Dave Christie. Dave is a self-proclaimed supply chain tragic. Hi Dave, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I thought it might be good if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, because obviously you have vast experience in this area.
Kia ora, Gareth, and hey, thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast. Yes, I am a tragic, and yes, I do enjoy talking about supply chain, much to my friends and my family's displeasure. So I guess a bit of a background is, when I left secondary school, I went into the New Zealand Army as an officer trainee and graduated as a logistics officer, and then spent 15 years as a logistics officer in the New Zealand Army, learning how to do logistics, moving equipment, people, resources, across New Zealand and around the world. And at the end of that, I then got the opportunity to go and work with PricewaterhouseCoopers Consulting as a supply chain manager. And so the advantage there for this, I guess, podcast is I got to go and work across a whole range of sectors, industries in the supply chain, and working in all different parts of the supply chain, which I think we might cover a bit more later on. Then after that, I had an ambition of, I guess I like to work with organisations who I think are kind of high purpose or have an important role to play in New Zealand's economy. And so the warehouse was my next journey, and absolutely loved working there with Stephen Tyndall. Retail is an extremely difficult sector, and the supply chains are quite complex. So learnt a lot there, and then moved on to Fonterra, the New Zealand's biggest company, probably got the biggest supply chain in New Zealand. Sending 80-odd% of its product goes across the equator. So as a consequence, the supply chain challenges that are faced by that, from getting milk from a farm in Te Awamutu all the way to, say, a customer in Colombo in Sri Lanka, that's a really big challenge. After Fonterra, I then went to Coda, which is Fonterra's fourth-party logistics provider. It's a sister company to Katahi. Lots of people have probably heard of Katahi. Coda manages the landside logistics on behalf of Fonterra and over 100 other customers. So then that was landside logistics. And then after that, I decided to leave and do my own. I wanted to kind of see if I could have an impact on a broader space rather than working in a corporate, working for other organisations. And so started off with Waikato Tainui, still with them actually, working with Tainui Group Holdings, building the Ruakura Super Hub down in Waikato. And for me, that is a significant piece of infrastructure, what I'd call strategic logistics infrastructure for New Zealand, not just for Hamilton, not just for Waikato, not just for the North Island, but for New Zealand. And so that's why one of the reasons why I was interested in building that and getting involved in building that from the ground up. Equally, I've done quite a bit of work with government agencies over the COVID period, helping cut New Zealand businesses who have really struggled, and in particular SMEs. And again, we may want to talk a bit more about that, Gareth. And then finally, I've more recently got involved in a startup, a technology startup, which is involved in supply chain technology, because from all that work I've done, I can see where there are holes and gaps, and I think technology is going to be one of the key ways forward to help New Zealand businesses, improve and drive better service and outcomes from their supply chains. So sorry, that was a bit of a long spiel there, Gareth, but that's my background.
No, that's great. Really appreciate that. And that gives great context of just the vast experience you have in this area. And included in there with government agencies, I think from what you told me previously, you have done a bit of work with the Ministry of Transport as well on this actual national supply chain strategy they've been working on? Yeah,
that's correct. So as part of them developing their strategy, they created a industry reference group, which was made up of supply chain professionals and freight professionals from around the country in different sectors. And I was invited to be part of that, and so I was part of that forum as they were developing this strategy that you referred to at the start of the podcast. So that probably is a relevant point for what this conversation today, right?
Great. Yeah, no, that's great. Look, I think a good point to sort of kick off the main part of the discussion maybe is how do you explain to people who may never really think about supply chains or the movement of freight just how important these systems and industries are to them and their lifestyle and the economy more broadly?
Yeah, and I think COVID, I mean, my personal experience, Gareth, is that supply chain's been buried in the cupboards. You know, it's always the sales people, the marketing people, the finance people who are kind of the glory people in businesses. And it's us supply chain and logistics people who just kind of get into the trenches and get the work done. But I think, and so we're an invisible part of business and society, I think. And what COVID highlighted is that actually, if you don't get your supply chains right, then things go drastically wrong. And as examples we saw through COVID, even in offshore, but even in New Zealand, you know, empty retail shelves, you know, of essentials, like some might say toilet paper, but other products, you know, bread, whatever it may be. And I think the concern I have is we feel we've come out of COVID and people are kind of going, oh, the supply chain's resolved. So the analogy I use is the sinking tide. So if you can imagine, there's a whole lot of issues, I think, with New Zealand's supply chain and businesses' supply chains. And then what happened with COVID is the tide went out and we saw these rocks, they were exposed, you know, and we started to kind of deal with those, but we dealt with them in what I would say is very unsophisticated ways. And as COVID's kind of rebounded, the tide's rising again and everyone's forgotten about the rocks below the water and they're now just going back on and focusing on what they were doing before COVID. So the supply chain, the thing that everyone sees is the physical aspect of a supply chain. They see the trucks, the trains, the planes, the boats, the warehouses. They see the retail stores, and that's the visible part of the supply chain. What's really important to understand is that there's an invisible part of the supply chain, which is what we call the data chain. And nothing in the physical chain moves unless something happens in the data chain. So as a real simple example, you know, that loaf of bread that needs to get onto the retail shelf, your supermarket shelf, that doesn't move until a data signal is, say, sent to Goodman Fielder, for example, and they then actually say, okay, we need to make that loaf of bread. We then need to move it through to the distribution centres and then through to the retail store. So it's that data chain where I think there is significant weakness in New Zealand's supply chain and in a lot of businesses' supply chains. But hopefully it's a high-level, simple explanation of what it is.
Yeah. Look, in the Ministry of Transport's strategy document, there's a foreword from David Parker, who, of course, is the now former Minister of Transport following the election on the weekend. Yes. And he talks about major disruptions to freight and supply chains, as you've noted, caused by COVID-19 and obviously the response to COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously, severe weather events that we've experienced in New Zealand in recent years, and all of this contributing to increased costs, delays, and uncertainties. I just thought it'd be interesting to look. You know, you did mention that people kind of are in the mindset of, oh, COVID's behind us, supply chains are all back, and everything's fine again. Yeah. But in terms of just how badly impacted was New Zealand through that period, and also in terms of costs, how are things looking now compared to the pre-COVID world?
Okay, can I answer that question in a few ways, Gareth? Firstly, I think it's important to understand that supply chains are complex ecosystems. And so, if any of your listeners understand systems thinking, there's a thing called the butterfly effect where the theory is a butterfly flaps its wing in Siberia and indirectly causes a cyclone, let's say, in Florida. And so that happens in supply chains. And we saw some classic examples of that through COVID. There was that vessel that turned sideways in the Suez Canal. And everyone thought that has nothing to do with New Zealand. But because the shipping lanes are all interconnected, then that created bottlenecks through the shipping networks, which then caused delays at the transshipment points. And New Zealand uses three main transshipment points for our imports and exports: Singapore, and then two in Malaysia. And they were all congested. So as a consequence, while we thought this vessel all the way on the other side of the world has no impact on us, in fact, it had major impact to our vessel, to delays in getting products to New Zealand or actually getting vessel capacity away from New Zealand. So that was one example. I'll give you another. New Zealand's an exporting nation. Approximately 30% of our GDP comes from exported goods. And so getting our goods to offshore markets is absolutely critical for us as a country, as for our economy, for our prosperity. And so therefore what's central to that then is getting ships to New Zealand, because as you may be aware, 99% of New Zealand's products are exported in vessel, only 1% go in planes. And that 1% are the high value products that can afford the higher cost of air freight. So anyway, so 99% of exports leave via vessel. Well, over COVID, we had an effective 30% reduction in the amount of ship capacity on our coast. And that was because of just the delays that were occurring in the global shipping network. So for normally a ship says we'll have a vessel coming to New Zealand once service a week. In order to do that, depending on where they're coming from and going to, they may have actually 6 or 7 or 8 vessels in a cycle. And all of those vessels need to kind of connect into these different points. And if they get delayed there and they get held up, like we saw all of these photos happening in ports around the world, then that delays New Zealand. And so as a consequence, we lost vessel capacity on the coastline of New Zealand. And what that really meant is that the big companies, the big boys and girls who had the buying power, they could get access to the reduced shipping capacity on our coast. The people and the organisations who really missed out were the small to medium-sized businesses, because they didn't have buying power, they don't understand supply chain, and they didn't actually have the relationships that allowed them to ensure that their products and services could get offshore. So that was the first part of your question. Let me just finish the second part. You talked about costs. So through COVID, we saw some significant increase in shipping costs. So there was some typically, and as a rule of thumb, you might say $3,000 to get a New Zealand export box to America. We saw numbers like 20,000, so 6-7 times higher for some trade lanes, for some customers, whereas the big players didn't experience. They experienced some uplift in costs, but not these massive uplift in costs. And it's the SMEs who borne these costs. What's happened now subsequently, and this goes to my point about rising tide, is actually now, because the demand softened in the world marketplace, the shipping lines who were absolutely flush and didn't have any spare capacity, they've now got tons of spare capacity. So as a consequence, the prices have dropped, and they've actually, in some markets and some trade lanes, dropped below the pre-COVID levels, which is reinforcing that this, in my mind, everyone's going, oh, it's all good, the supply chain's fixed now. But in fact, I think the fundamental issues that are impacting New Zealand businesses' supply chains and impacting New Zealand's supply chain as a whole are still just sitting there and just buried under the rising tide.
Yeah, that's a good point to pick up on next. So I guess with the Ministry of Transport describing its project as New Zealand's first ever comprehensive freight and supply chain strategy.
Yeah.
There's a range of problems and challenges then I guess they are trying to tackle through this.
Yes.
Can you give us a bit of a rundown, I guess, on maybe what some of the key ones are?
I think it's important to understand our position, and like we've often heard that New Zealand is geographically remote as a country in the world, right? And that's part of who we are. That's what makes me proud about being, this country at the bottom of the world. But it also makes us vulnerable from a global supply chain perspective. And I think it hasn't been put any better than a recent paper written by David Skilling from the Landfall Group on behalf of the New Zealand Productivity Commission. And it was titled "Supply Chains to the Last Bus Stop on the Planet." And so if you just listen to it, I think that's a classic. That's a fantastic title, because it describes our position, where we are. And we are the last bus stop. And as a consequence, not only are we the last bus stop, but we're probably the smallest bus stop on the planet. And so as a consequence, we have no buying power in reality in the global stage. And we're extremely vulnerable to these events that happen offshore, to what then impacts us. And what we saw through COVID is we have no resilience. We have, or perhaps not say no, but low levels of resilience in our supply chain, which therefore means when the other parts of the world's global supply chain sneezes or has a cough, we catch a cold or pneumonia, and it has this significant impact on us as a country. So. And if you're a government, and again, I'm taking a very privileged position of saying, let's say we are a government and we're going, well, how do we look forward and help New Zealand have a more resilient, more productive supply chain? then I think those are the right questions to ask. And I think this is what Ministry of Transport is fundamentally trying to do. They've seen the pains that have come through from having a immature, unproductive, unresilient supply chain, and as a consequence of that, they're saying we need to do something better. So I think what the Ministry of Transport's trying to do is really good. It's as we said at the start, it's an extremely complex topic, and I think there's a challenge for the country as a whole here. But what Ministry of Transport have done is they've tried to take the first step forward into this empty space and actually start the process of developing a supply chain and freight strategy for New Zealand.
One of the things that they've got in the strategy is 3-year, 10-year, and 30-year horizons, and looking at focus areas for those times. Now, there's a lot of detail in there, and we're not obviously going to have the time to go into all of it now. But in terms of the 3-year one of the key areas that they're looking at is ports. Ports are a fascinating subject in New Zealand, I think. Yes. So, I mean, one of the things is we obviously have quite a lot of them, and we have local government ownership in all of the ones I can think of.
Well, most of them, except for Tauranga. Most of them. Yeah, Tauranga is probably the only main one that's not.
Yeah. So I guess that means there's a bit of parochialism that goes into the ownership too, and we often talk about trying to build, I guess, having a national interest and a national strategy. So I wonder, with our ports and with their ownership structure, I mean, this is an issue that's been discussed and debated quite a bit past over the years. So what improvements can we make? I mean, do we have too many ports? And how can we sort of work towards the national interest here?
Well, can I go back a step in that question, Gareth? Because I think the problem that you're highlighting is, in my mind, is our connectivity to the world. And the point I raised before about 99% of our exports go via vessel. And in reality, most of our imports as well come in via vessel. So if we look at it from a shipping line perspective, and I will get to ports, but I think we need to understand the broader context. Most of the shipping lines come to New Zealand. We're as we've said before, we're at the bottom of the world. So in order for a vessel to come to New Zealand, they've got to travel a long distance, and so travelling costs money for them. The other challenge we've got for New Zealand is we're what's called a net exporting nation. So we export more product than we import, and so therefore the shipping lines have to bring empty containers. So they have to basically travel with empty boxes down to New Zealand in order to meet our outbound export needs. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that our exports are predominantly produce, which therefore mean they need reefer containers or refrigerated containers, and yet most of our imports are ambient products which don't need refrigeration. So you've got what we would call a product mix imbalance taking place there as well. So what normally happens for the shipping lines, and this is a bit of a generalisation, is that they come to New Zealand, they arrive first in Auckland, and they drop the majority of the import boxes into Auckland because that's where they need to go before they can get redistributed around the country. Then the ships bounce down the coast of New Zealand in order to pick up exports. And the reason they do that is because the majority of our exports are created and formed in the regions, being it dairy products, produce, forestry, whatever those primary exports are. And so therefore the ships have to bounce down the coast, go to these multiple ports, pick up exports. They then typically come back up to Tauranga, and Port of Tauranga is typically the last port of call for most vessels, not all, but most, before they then go back to deep water and they head off offshore. So if you think about that from a shipping line point of view, what's the most efficient model? For the most efficient model for a shipping line is they come into one port, they unload, they reload, and they go. But what we as a country are asking them to do is to bounce around the coast and spend 7 or so days on the coast, dropping off, picking up. So that is inefficient for the shipping lines, but also what it means is from a shipping lines is that they can only have a certain size vessel because most of the New Zealand ports in New Zealand can only cope with a limited size vessel. And just to give you some reference around that, the average vessel to New Zealand is around about 4,500 to 5,000 TEU. That's a good acronym we use, which stands for a 20-foot equivalent unit or a 20-foot container. So 4 to 5,000 TEU for a normal ship coming to New Zealand. Well, the ships coming off the production lines in China right now are 22 to 24,000 TEU. So these vessels coming to New Zealand are small by comparison, and they are they are a little bit inefficient because they're typically a little bit older. So, and what's happening in the global stage is as these bigger vessels come into the marketplace, there's an effect called the trickle-down effect. And the shipping lines are then putting these bigger vessels, as they come in, they go into the main east-west trade lanes, and then the other ones start to go down to the tributaries and including down to New Zealand. So now to come back to your question, Gareth, around the ports. For me personally, if I look at what I think is the most optimal supply chain design for New Zealand, it is to have a super port, or you might call it a mega port, where the big vessels come in and they unload everything and they reload everything. So that would be, I think, nirvana. But if you think about who we are as a country, we're long and narrow. We've got 2 different islands. We've got multiple different ports. So you can't say that. I don't think that's a realistic, future scenario for New Zealand. There could be subsets or minor versions of it, but right now, I don't think there is. I think what we do need to do, though, is actually have what we would call bigger ports and let's say secondary ports. And I think Ministry of Transport have already started to signal this. So prior to this, or separate to the strategy document, they have reinforced and put some more money into the marketplace to support coastal shipping. And what that then does is that really reinforces this hub and spoke model. So what I mean by that is that the vessels, there's a local sort of vessels that go around the New Zealand coastline and they mop up all the containers, both imports and exports, but they bring them to main port hubs. And then these main port hubs are more efficient. They've got larger volumes. They've got deeper berths, which allow them to take the bigger ships. So your question is around, I think there's about 12 different regional ports at the moment. Just to give you an example, Australia's got, I think, 4 main ports, and they're 5 times our economy. California's, I think, got 3, and they're like 5 or 6 times our economy. So yes, I think the simple answer to your question is yes, we have too many ports. Yes, I don't think it's sustainable for the future. And so, yes, I think something needs to change. What that change is, I think, is a hub and spoke model. And therefore, I think that's important for the country to realise this, and B, for Ministry of Transport to signal this, because actually that influences a whole lot of different investments, a whole lot of different strategies for those currently regional ports. Whether they need to be privatised, like, part of what Napier has and what Port of Tauranga is, that's a bit more of a strategic question there, to be fair, Gareth.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talk about Australia having 4 major ports. I mean, as you say, like population 5 times ours, but also geographically, Australia is a continent. Yeah. We're a couple of relatively small islands. Yeah. So that's a really interesting context. So I guess if we go to this hub and spoke model, I mean, how many hubs do we ultimately have? And one of the arguments is also, just picking up on what you were saying about the ships coming down here. I mean, you talk about the east-west trade routes. I mean, we're talking there about between sort of North America, China, Asia, across to Europe, really, aren't we? The big population, big economy centres in the world. Yeah. And we're obviously in the completely opposite direction. Yeah.
Can I just, the analogy or the symbolism I use to help describe that to people is the capital T, the letter. And if you imagine in the horizontal part of the capital T is a very thick bolded line, and that reinforces the volume of trade that goes east-west between the Americas, Asia, China, and Europe. And that's obviously where all the big vessels go. And then you have the stem of the T coming down. If you look at it on a globe, it's actually not vertical. It kind of it teeters off to the right, but it comes down from typically those places I mentioned to Malaysia and Singapore, where it then comes down to New Zealand, and then they bounce around the coast. Now that's quite a simplified. In truth, the reality is they stop at different places in between, and there are some vessels that go direct to the west coast and east coast of the US. But as a guide and as a kind of principle of how it generally works, that provides, I think, a good overview. So sorry I interrupted you there, Gareth.
No, that's fine. But I'm just thinking in terms of hubs.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea? Do you have a view on how many hub ports we should have, and where would they be best placed in the country?
Yeah. Oh, geez, you're gonna get.
I'm putting you on the spot.
You are, Gareth, and this is. If anyone's listening, if this was a phone conversation, I imagine the phones would be ringing hot straight after this. So the way I answer that question is I go back to first principles, and And what I mean by that is that you want, as I discussed before, you want to minimise the amount of what we would call empty running or wasted travel. And I don't just mean from a shipping line point of view, I mean then from the landside perspective as well. So that's getting product to and from the port. So we've got a lot of waste in our domestic supply chain as well, not just on our shipping connections. And so if you think about, okay, so what's the reason for aggregation? You aggregate in order to drive scale, which allows you to drive economies, which actually allows you to reduce waste. And then all of that allows you to be more productive. And so ideally, as I said, it would be one. But because of who we are as a country, I think as a minimum, you've got to have resilience. And actually, if you only had one, then some product's got to move a very long distance to get to that location. So I think as a minimum, we probably need to have two, which means you have one in each island. But even then, you go, well, what happens if one of those go down? So I don't think it's a simple black or white answer, but I think you start to form a picture where you've got these two larger sized hubs, one in each country. And then you kind of go, well, which ones? And in my mind, it comes to you want to bring your imports, which in the North Island predominantly come to Auckland, and you want to bring your exports, which predominantly go out of Tauranga, together. And so in order to make that happen, you've got to have a facility that has the infrastructure to cope with the bigger ships and the channel depth to allow those bigger vessels, which are deeper, to actually come and go. And then they need to have the domestic transport infrastructure connections that allow for this high volume, high capacity movement of freight to and from that port. And I mean, I'll let you and the listeners form your own viewpoints, but we just heard recently, Roger Gray has come out into the marketplace saying that Auckland will be a premium import port because they're not going to try and be everything to everyone. Which I can understand it if you're Roger. I can understand that's the strategy that he should be playing in order to drive the value to his shareholders, which are currently Auckland City Council. But if you think about it from a principles perspective, you go, well, I think that's the wrong answer for New Zealand. It might be the right answer for Auckland and Roger. I think it's the wrong answer for New Zealand, because for New Zealand, and I'm talking 20, 30 years into the future, I think we need to bring our imports and exports flows into the same place. And therefore, is that Auckland or is that somewhere else? That's, I think, a broader question to ask and answer.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Obviously, we talked about some of the problems that businesses experienced during the worst period of the COVID pandemic. And obviously, you noted that some of the bigger corporates didn't fare as badly as the SMEs because they had more connections and links and volume, I guess, too.
Yes.
But I do recall some of the bigger companies were chartering their own vessels during the COVID period.
Yeah, they did.
And I thought this is quite interesting when you compare it with what happened with air freight. So obviously the government stumped up quite a bit of money to keep air freight going. And I mean, I guess that was partly because passenger travel via planes wasn't happening. And a lot of that air freight goes in the holds of passenger planes.
Correct.
So they needed to keep the flights going so the air freight could get out. But it did make me think, we have our national airline, and obviously the government does tend to bail it out, every now and again, shall we say, or at least support it. But it's a long time since we've had a New Zealand shipping line. I'm just wondering, to what extent is that the idea of New Zealand having, whether it's a national shipping line or a privately owned New Zealand shipping line even, to what extent is that being canvassed in these discussions with the Ministry of Transport? And do you think there's some merit in doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that was some of the feedback that Ministry of Transport got when they went into their consultation process for from the issues paper. Can I answer that in two ways? Firstly, you started off the question around the challenges that some of the larger players had. So yes, they did have challenges because there was less shipping capacity in the market at the time. But because they are large players and because they have significant volume in New Zealand terms, they have buying power. And so Fonterra during COVID exported more containers ever in that period when there was 30% less capacity on the New Zealand coastline in container capacity. Zespri, AFCO, or part of the Tallies Group, and Turners and Growers, all and even together chartered bulk ships. And so these are vessels that you wouldn't normally use for your exports, because normally exports go into containers, but because they couldn't get container vessels and because they couldn't get the reefer containers, they actually chartered reefer ships, cargo vessels, and they put their product into those, and then they went off to those offshore markets. But they had the buying power to do that. 97% of New Zealand businesses are small to medium businesses, which are less than 50 employees. And they don't actually have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the experience, the capability, or the buying power to go and organise that. When I was at Fonterra, I was part of a supply chain team which was 100 strong. And so we had the capability and the knowledge of how to resolve this solution. Turners and Growers, Zespri, they're all the same. The small players don't. So that's the first, I think, reason why it's important to understand what happened during COVID, and actually then go, if we want to support these 97% of businesses who are basically our future Fonterras, our future Zespris, then I think we need to actually spend more time working out how can we help them, how can we actually help them become stronger, fitter in the supply chain sense, and actually more resilient, so they actually don't suffer the pains that they did suffer through COVID. So that was the first part. Coming back to your question around New Zealand owning a shipping line, I don't think that any government on the planet, let alone the New Zealand government, has got a good track record of running commercial enterprises. The shipping sector is extremely volatile. Prior to COVID, they'd been in 7 years of significant losses, almost every shipping company in the globe. In order to try and offset that, there's been a whole lot of consolidation. So there was 13, mid-teens number of shipping lines, and now there's probably only in the low teens, high single figures. And they've done that to try and consolidate and get better economies of scale. Through COVID, those shipping lines made killer profits, absolutely stellar profits, right? And that was and then some would say inconscionable profits. And now after COVID, they're now back to pricing levels below what was pre-COVID. So they've gone back to this kind of the other side. So they live in this boom-bust cycle. And so to your question, would New Zealand, would a taxpayer in New Zealand want the government to invest in a sector like that, where there is such big swings in boom and bust, and there's such risk? I could potentially see if we make a conscious decision as a country to go down this path of hub and spoke, and we actually signal to everyone this is the way our future shipping and network supply chain is going to look like, then it does need to have vessels going around the coast. And we do have some vessels on the New Zealand coast already, which are New Zealand-owned or flag-owned vessels. But maybe we could actually grow that and support New Zealand vessels doing the coastal shipping, whereas it's just the international flag-bearing ships which come and do the line haul shift between New Zealand and the rest of the world. Potentially that's a scenario.
Okay. One of the things that's quite notable when you flick through or read the actual Ministry of Transport strategy is climate change is a big factor in there. So I think it's a 62-page report, and I noted it mentions climate change 29 times. So there's quite a bit on it.
You did a word search there, did you, Gareth?
I did do a quick word search on that one because I did notice it was coming up a lot. And it says that the goal is for the freight sector to reduce emissions by 35% by 2035, based on 2019 levels, to support meeting New Zealand's 2050 net zero carbon target. And says this will be challenging because freight volumes are projected to increase by 20% during that time frame. And then road freight is responsible for almost a quarter of transport emissions. So obviously there's a decarbonisation push going on. I say in the background, but it's a bit more than in the background these days, isn't it? It's quite prominent in here. So, I mean, how does the industry manage this? I mean, how does the industry feel about this? And how hard is it going to be to actually decarbonise the supply chain and freight sectors?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Gareth. Firstly, as a New Zealander and as a citizen of New Zealand and the planet, I think it's we need to do something about carbon emissions, and so I do buy into the concept that we've got to reduce emissions. And I accept that the government has signed up to the Kyoto Protocol and the 2050 carbon neutral. or carbon zero, sorry. How you achieve it, I think I've probably got some different views on, and I won't delve into those on this call. But what I will say is that in the logistics and supply chain sector in New Zealand, it's quite difficult. And I've kind of got first-hand experience of that with my involvement at Ruakura Super Hub, where it effectively the whole strategy for Ruakura is to resolve some of these issues that I've been highlighting earlier. And what I mean by that is that we're trying to bring all of the disparate freight flows, the import, the export, and the domestic freight flows together. And then what we're trying to do is take them off-road and put them onto rail. And there's one more step we're doing there. And we're currently, I won't try not to get into too much detail, but currently most freight flows in New Zealand are what we call two-way. So if I want to get an export box, say, to Tauranga, I first have to pay for an empty box to come from Tauranga to wherever I'm packing it, to then fill it up and then take it back to Tauranga. So that's, as you see, is a round trip, it's two-way, and 9 times out of 10 that's on road at the moment. And if I then switched my hat and looked at imports, they're doing exactly the same thing in the reverse, and it's not coordinated with the exports in the main. So the opportunity for New Zealand to reduce emissions, I think, exists because a lot of these movements are occurring firstly on road, and secondly they're occurring in round trip. And one of the analysis that we did in Ruakura is that if we believe that once we fully develop out Ruakura, and just to give you an example, it's 600 hectares in total land area, which is larger than Auckland's CBD, and it'll become the largest logistics and industrial freight hub in New Zealand, but also in Australasia. When that's fully developed, we estimate we'll take about 65,000 truck movements off Waikato roads and up to Auckland and across the Bay of Plenty. If you just think about that, 65,000 trucks. If you've ever travelled over the Kaimais recently, you just continuously get held up by trucks going in either directions. So that 65,000 trucks we think will reduce carbon emissions by about 13,000 tonnes a year. So, which is a significant impact, right? But it's small in the New Zealand total scale, but important for that region and for that. So I think that's one reason to do it. But actually, when we're talking to customers and we're saying to them, this is what rail does, because rail is roughly 66%, I think, is what Kiwi Rail say, more efficient, more carbon efficient than a road equivalent. So you're burning 66% less carbon, or creating 66% less carbon. So that's great, and when we go and talk to potential customers, they buy into that, they accept that. But the decisions that customers make are first and foremost on cost. And so if rail isn't cheaper than road, then you're never going to get them to transition across to a rail model. In the current economic conditions, where there is no cost of from carbon impact in the environment. So one of the things that we've been able to do with our work with Port of Tauranga at Ruakura and with the Kiwi Rail is we have now put in a one-way rail solution into the marketplace for importers and exporters, and we can demonstrate approximately 30% cost savings versus their current round-trip road-based model, right? So therefore you get the first tick. It's a cheaper rail transport solution, which is kind of you get past the first hurdle. And then you go and say, but not only is it cheaper, it's actually more carbon efficient, and it's got it's better for the environment, and it has less trucks on the road, which means from the social impact point of view, there's less congestion on our roads. So in my mind, it's a tick, tick, tick across the board. And what's surprised me is that we haven't actually had people coming knocking on our door. We're having to go and knocking on people's door to tell them that there's this different model out there. So I think there's a bit of a slow uptake on rail, and that's probably because rail has always been quite costly and extremely complex to work with. If you think about a road move, it's what we would call point to point. I pick it up from point A and I deliver it to point B. If you go and do a rail move, I have to pick up from point A, I have to go to a rail head to put it on rail, it then transports, so I have to go to the next rail head, take it off it, and then deliver it to point B. So there's more handling, it's more complex, and it's slower. But rail's definitely got a place in the New Zealand economy, and I don't think we as a country are using rail enough at the moment, and that's because road is easier and cheaper than rail in most cases.
Another thing that a trend that emerged during the COVID period is this move towards onshoring. I
Yes,
note in particular the US. I
yes.
read a lot of interesting articles about manufacturing sort of coming home as they put it, and it was partly due to the tensions between the US and China as well that have obviously built in recent years. I'm just wondering in a New Zealand context, to what extent can or should this happen? And then I guess a secondary sort of question to that is, should we look at maybe having reserve stocks in New Zealand of things like fuel? I mean, I note that Marsden Point's obviously closing or closed. I think it's closed, isn't it?
Yes.
And key import foods, medical supplies. I mean, other countries, I know China, of course, does with its economy, but other countries like Switzerland do it as well.
That's right.
The US famously has its oil stocks as well, reserve stocks. Is this something New Zealand should do more of? Or do at all, actually?
Well, so let me answer that second question first. I think the simple answer is yes, and that's because of our vulnerabilities. And COVID has highlighted just how vulnerable we are to disruptions in the global supply chain. So when I look at supply chain, I use this model called the SCORE model. It's a model that comes out of North America. It comes out the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it's called the Supply Chain Operations Research, or SCORE model. And it's a simplified model to try and look at this very complex ecosystem. And so when you look at, and I'll very quickly go through it, it has strategy at the top. It then goes through planning, and it's how you move supply and demand, and then it goes left to right across the supply chain: source, make, move, sell, and then underneath it's all the enable stuff, and that's technology, people, processes, sustainability, assurance, all that stuff. Right. So that's the mental model. When I look at the Ministry of Transport's freight and supply chain strategy, they are very strongly focusing on what I would call as the move box, and which is great because they are the Ministry of Transport, right? And that sits in the move box, but when I think about supply chain, I don't just think about move. I think about the whole gambit, the whole ecosystem. And so your point then around reserve stocks, in my mind, sits in the planning box and sits in the procurement box, which Ministry of Transport don't cover. So part of what I think here is that while the Ministry of Transport's freight and supply chain strategy is a good start and it's a step in the right direction, it is by no means complete. It is, and they'll probably tell this to yourself. And the reason I think that's the issue is because at the moment what you've got is a lot of the different government agencies all looking at different parts of this very complex ecosystem. Now you have customs looking at our border entry and protection. You've got MPI looking at our biosecurity. You've got NZT supporting New Zealand businesses who are exporters. You've got Ministry of Transport worried about our transport network. If it might be MB, if I was correct in what I said before, who's looking at what our reserve and strategy stock level should be. But these are all disjointed. In my mind, there is no single common overarching strategy and or group who's sitting across all of these things to say what's the most important we should be doing to protect New Zealand's supply chain and ensure that it supports us for the future.
This is back to your earlier point about systems thinking, I guess, isn't it?
Yes.
Looking at the full picture.
Yeah, exactly right.
Fair enough. And I note too that the Productivity Commission has an inquiry underway into improving the resilience of the New Zealand economy to persistent supply chain disruption. So that's another government body, I guess.
Yeah, correct. Yes, 100%.
In this broader area.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Dave, if you were to, I guess, look at where things are at overall with New Zealand supply chains and freight, what would be your diagnosis?
Yeah. Great choice of words, Gareth, because I guess I've thought about this quite a bit. If I was a doctor who was diagnosing the New Zealand supply chain as my patient, I would have to say the diagnosis is that we're in serious, if not critical, condition. And perhaps staying with that human analogy and referring it to the supply chain, the New Zealand, the heart is the beating production sector of New Zealand. And while that's performing well, I think it's actually unproductive, and we've seen this multiple times through the Productivity Commission's reports. So our heart isn't beating as efficiently as it can. The arteries and veins are the networks that flows products and goods around, not just, let's say, New Zealand, but the globe, they are constrained. We've got clearly cholesterol in there, and we've got we've got a high blood pressure. We've got parts of our network where the blood doesn't flow correctly, so it's not getting to the extremities well. Our nervous system is we're actually deaf, dumb, and blind. We don't know where the problems are and where they're coming from, so we just get smacked in the face. And we're probably suffering from early onset dementia, where we don't actually have the cognitive ability to actually learn from our mistakes and improve, and so we continue to make the same mistakes. So I realise I'm being a bit emotive here, but this is my view of the New Zealand supply chain, and I'm a passionate New Zealander who wants New Zealand to succeed and grow and prosper. I just look at our supply chain and go, it's so disparate, it's so dysfunctional, it's so unproductive. There is a better way of doing this for businesses and for New Zealand as a whole. So, hopefully that, staying with this though, but we know lots of patients who are serious and in critical condition. If they get the right care, they can come out the other end better, stronger and more resilient. And I honestly believe that is the potential future for us in New Zealand and our supply chain.
A couple more questions. We could keep going all day on this, but we won't this time.
Yes.
So with the Ministry of Transport having this strategy, one of the things that's interesting to me in all this is the role of the government in this. We're talking about a more collaborative approach. We're talking about, New Zealand being very reliant on obviously international markets, getting our goods out there, bringing our imports in, tackling climate change. So doing all of this does obviously require a level of government involvement. The question, I guess, is around where does the government's role start and end? And obviously, with the election on the weekend, we've now got a new government who, historically, the parties that are going to make up the new government are probably less inclined to be involved and leave things more to the private sector, probably than Labor typically do, although it ebbs and flows. And there's often quite a bit of agreement. So I'm just wondering, where does the government's role start and end in your view in all of this? And are you confident that, with a change of government, all this work, which I can see from what you're saying, you do see a lot of value in it. Are you confident it's going to continue as it started, I guess?
Yeah, $54,000 question, Gareth. I think it's the government has only really, in my mind, as a supply chain practitioner, started to understand supply chain through COVID. Supply chains existed prior to COVID, but it was only because of the pains that the constituents experienced through COVID did they start to really realise it. And I might be being unkind to perhaps previous governments, but that's my perception. And so and even from the MOT's responses to their strategy, I know there was lots of feedback from organisations to just leave us alone and we'll get on with it, right? Because we don't want the government meddling in businesses. But I don't think it's an either or here. And the reason I say that is because in order for New Zealand to strengthen our supply chains and make them more resilient and actually more ability and with a greater ability to respond and predict these global disruptions and therefore get in front of them and actually not be smacked in the face by them, but actually see them coming and actually pivot and adjust before they've even come and impacted us, then we need to grow our capability and our understanding of supply chain. These organisations who are doing this right now, so they've got these control systems and control towers and they're looking forward, they're seeing global events and they're making supply chain and business decisions in advance of that event impacting their business. So it's not as if that's fairy dust. I think also in order to help New Zealand become better compete and win better on the global stage, we do need to have investment. And the problem with supply chain is that they are very long-term investments. And this again, and if I can just kind of come back to Ruakura Super Hub, I don't think there will be many developers who would have done this because it has been in the works for 14 years. They've spent over $100 million of their own money to build this strategic piece of logistics infrastructure. Normal commercial entities wouldn't do that. So I think there's either that's got to be government, which in government supported us, to be fair. Government tipped in some shovel-ready money, and then Hamilton City Council tipped in a bit of money as well. But the bulk of the cost has been borne by Tainui Group Holdings, and so they've done that. It's because they have this long-term vision. They think 30 years out, and they think and go, well, what next generation? And therefore, yes, it's a lot of money now, but what is it going to do? Not next year, not in the standard 3 to 3 year business cycle, but 30 years into the future. So, on that regard, I applaud Ministry of Transport for having that 30-year horizon, because it would have been very easy to stop at the 10 and go, well, that's good enough. But it's not good enough, because a lot of this infrastructure requires a 30-year horizon of where we're going to be. And whether it's, to our earlier conversation, whether it's a single port in each island, which we're going to double down on and say this port is our strategic port for this island, we therefore need to invest in that. We need to invest in building rail connections, high-capacity rail connections, high-capacity road connections. We need to do the same for airports, which is probably going to be Auckland and, let's say, Christchurch. But we've got to do all of this work, and that all costs money, and they all have a long investment pipeline. So government has a role in that space, definitely, and because it won't happen without them, I don't think, and without them putting some really strong signals into the marketplace. I think also through COVID, we started to see government play with some of the regulatory settings in order to help products flow. And that's definitely a lever that government has and controls. I think making trade easier is really important for New Zealand, who's so reliant on trade. And so government has made some steps in that space, especially around digitising trade, which I think is really, really important. But I think there's more we can do. So to your question, I think, yes, government has a role to play. I think there needs to be clear sandpits where, because of the characteristics, government looks after these aspects, and then business and other entities are responsible for getting on and doing it within their own sandpit. But if you want to make a change, and hopefully you're hearing from this conversation, is I think we do need to change as a country, then I think we're going to have some tough conversations. And let's say, for example, we say we are going to go to a hub and spoke model with, say, 2 or maybe 3 main ports in New Zealand. Well, that's, currently with all of those other ports in New Zealand, that'll probably, they'll jump up and down about it, because at the moment they are responsible for generating revenues to the regional councils, who are using them to help pay for regional council, activities and costs. So to your earlier question you asked me, I think we're going to have to change some of the settings, and that's going to be unpleasant. But in my mind, it's always for the greater good. It's always about where does New Zealand need to be in the future, not about where is New Zealand today.
Absolutely. So we need some good joined up systems thinking and with some long-term horizons. Yeah. Look, thanks so much for that, Dave. That's Dave Christie, a self-proclaimed supply chain tragic and a vastly experienced practitioner of all things logistics and supply chains. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz, another episode of our Of Interest podcast.